Russia says it had no choice but to send its forces into parts of Ukraine amid criticism that President Vladimir Putin is bringing war back into Europe. Now, Russia claims its action is to demilitarize Ukraine and to stop NATO's threat of expansion towards Moscow. Now, Alexander Arefiev is the press attaché of the Russian embassy in Pretoria. He joins us now for more on the story. Alexander, thank you for talking to us this morning. How is the invasion being received in Russia? 1,700 anti-war protesters arrested, I believe it was in Moscow yesterday. Tell us about what people in your country are saying.
Well, first of all, it's not regarded as an invasion in Russia because we launched a special military operation not because Russia wanted to do this, it's because Russia had to do this. We can speak about that in volumes. Well, not actually tracking the situation in Russia. There are protests. Well, it's because in Russia we have democracy. People can disagree on certain things. So people who disagree with the actions, we can understand them, but it's fine.
So the people, part of the people who were involved in those anti-war protests that happened in Russia yesterday, why were they arrested if they are allowed to disagree?
They are allowed to disagree, but to hold the action, the march of protest, it needs to be approved by the authorities. I'm not in charge of the criminal cases, or I do not speak on behalf of Russian police, because they have to be legal basis for all this. I'm sorry, I just cannot comment on Russian police force, not their representative.
So there's been approaches into Ukraine from land, sea, and from the air, but you're still saying that it's not an invasion?
It's special military operation, because the point of this is not to occupy Ukraine. No, it's to demilitarize it and to conduct denazification, because unfortunately Nazism is on the rise in Ukraine, and no one else seems to be worried about this. So it's Nazism in Europe, and to protect the people in Lugansk Republic and the Lugansk People Republic, and Donetsk People Republic, Russia had to intervene because they approached Russia with a request to help them. Because for 8 years, these people have been bombarded by Ukrainian, by the Kiev regime forces, including children and women. Well, the Kiev regime disregarded all that, so they've been keep bombarding those people for 8 years in their civil war. There are kids in Donbass who were born in shelters, and they lived in shelters for their entire life so far. And as for the Europeans' reactions and Washington's reaction, well, they just disregarded this all. When Russia reported of mass graves of civilians killed by Kiev regime, Jem Psaki, the U.S. representative, she shrugged it off like it was disinformation, but there are photos of those mass graves, so it's not disinformation. And when President Putin spoke of genocide happening in Donbass, literal genocide, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, said it was funny. Well, Vladimir Putin resorted to the argument that there is a genocide in Donbass, which is really funny. That's what he said. What is funny? Genocide is funny. Yeah. Nazism is funny. Killing civilians is funny. What exactly is funny?
You're Alexander, echoing what President Vladimir Putin also said in his address to his nation. He talked about Russia not being able to feel safe, not being able to develop and to exist because of what he called a constant threat from modern Ukraine. It's similar to the comments that you're making this morning. He claims his goal is to protect people from bullying and from genocide. He says, as you've also said to us this morning, that the aim is for the demilitarization and the denazification of Ukraine. And in response to all of these comments, analysts are asking, where was this genocide in Ukraine? When did it happen? Many of them saying there is no such thing.
Yeah, that's what they say. But it started in 2014. And it started in 2014, and it's still going on it was going on till the last of the recent days. So they were just attacking the civilians in Donetsk and Lugansk, who decided to disagree with the unconstitutional coup that took place in 2014 in Kiev in February. So they disagreed with that. So did Crimea, and both of them got punished. Crimea with sanctions, and by the way, the water blockade. So the Ukrainians just cut off water supply to Crimea. You know, and Lugansk and Donetsk, well, the Kiev regime waged open war against their own people, against the civilians. So, and since no one else is listening, Lugansk and Donetsk just desperately cried for help for Russia, and Russia was the only one to respond.
Is it not about Ukraine's move towards the European Union, Alexander?
Come again?
Is it not about Ukraine's move towards the European Union and towards NATO?
It's not about Ukraine's move to European Union. As we said repeatedly, Russia feels the threat coming from NATO. And NATO uses Ukraine as a foothold against Russia. And they openly say so because they pump the country with weapons. They turned a blind eye on the blatant neo-Nazism flourishing in Ukraine because, well, they held marches, the torch-lit processions in honor of Stepan Bandera, who was Ukrainian Nazi collaborator during the World War II. Him and his accomplices are responsible for numerous war crimes, like killing 50,000 innocent people in Volhynia massacre. But these people, I mean, the terrorists led by Stepan Bandera, are revered in Ukraine. This is Nazism. This is open Nazism. But EU preferred to turn a blind eye on this. So did they with the genocide happening in Donbass. And recently, Ukrainian leadership declared that they wanted to redevelop nuclear weapons. Weapons.
Yeah. The UN saying that Vladimir Putin has chosen to bring war back to Europe. French President Emmanuel Macron is the only leader from that part of the world to, he says, have a passing discussion with Vladimir Putin over the last 24 to 36 hours or so, at the behest of Ukrainian President Zelensky. Zelensky says he can't get a hold of Vladimir Putin to try and bring the discussion to the table, to try and avert a war, an escalation here. Was this the only option available to Vladimir Putin, the Russian president?
Well, as Vladimir Putin explained, the EU and Ukrainians forced our hands because we've been trying to convince Ukraine to follow the Minsk agreements for 8 years. We tried to convince the Europeans to do something about Ukrainian sabotaging the Minsk agreements for 8 years. We also spoke to Washington on this behalf, and we also launched this initiative of the draft agreements of the security guarantees for Russia. This NATO-Russia discussion, as you may recall, recent developments. And what did we get in response? More sanctions, more threats of sanctions, and complete arrogance and disrespect to Russia's position. So, but people were still dying in Donbass all this time. So apparently no one else wanted to talk about this, and the Europeans disregarded this horrible events in Donbass for 8 years. I remind you, for 8 years. And now I get back to the previous point. Ukrainians they say that they wanted to develop nuclear weapons. Well, let's just think about this scenario. What if they develop nuclear weapons?
So this is a preemptive strike? What if? So it's a preemptive strike?
Denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. This is exactly what it is. To protect the people suffering from Nazi punishers, I can put it into other words, and Ukrainian Nazi punishers. They've been killing civilians for 8 years. How long do we have to wait?
Alexander, is Moscow concerned about the fallout for its own allies? If we think about China, for example, close ties to Moscow, but also close ties to the EU. We talk about the economic fallout for Russia itself. Stocks tumbling, the ruble is at record lows. Moscow index down by 30%. What are the concerns here for Russia and the months, or let's start with the days and weeks to come?
Well, the West has chosen the path of confrontation with Russia, apparently, because, well, when the special operation started, they spoke about sanctions again. They introduced new sanctions against Russia. Well, I'm not an economist, but, well, things are happening because the West is still wiping out the hysteria around the situation in Ukraine. So they used every possible pretext to introduce new sanctions. So we'll hope we'll find a way one day, but let's focus at what we have now at hand.
Alexander Arefiev, Russian Embassy Press Attaché, thank you for joining us this morning on the AM Report.
Thank you.
Certainly that's the big international story that we're trying to keep our eyes on here for you on the AM Report. And as you can see, the kind of information we're getting from the side of Ukrainian authorities, from people living in Ukraine, people with family and friends in Ukraine, and as you hear there, from the side of Russian authorities are like night and day, I should say. Completely different stories, as one would expect, as the UN describes it, war coming back to Europe. So it doesn't come as a surprise.